Hi guys, and welcome to the second revision video for the AQA Nazi Germany course. In part two, we're going to be looking at the growth of the Nazi Party in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the impact of the Great Depression, and how Hitler is able to become chancellor by 1933. We're also going to look at the different factors that allow Hitler to secure his power, consolidate his power, and make Germany a dictatorship. This part is much shorter than part one and much easier than part one as well. So let's just start off with a bit of a background about the Nazi Party. So the Nazi Party, Nazis is a nickname. They're actually called the NSDAP, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So you might see NSDAP in a source. It just means the Nazi Party. So the party were right-wing. They were extreme right-wing extremists, and they were fascists. So they're an extreme right-wing fascist party. They were actually started by a man called Anton Drexler, and Hitler took over the party in 1922. Hitler was the one that introduced the swastika, the red flag, the SA, brown shirts, introduced the uniform, the Heil Hitler salute. He really branded the party and got it a lot of the publicity. Without Hitler, arguably, the Nazi Party wouldn't have had any of the kind of traction that it had, because he really branded the party and sold the party in a way that got broad support. So the Nazi ideology is based all around German nationalism. They are a nationalist party. So nationalism is when you believe that your country is the strongest country in the world. You believe your country is superior to other countries. So they believed that Germans or Aryans were the strongest race, and that minorities like Jewish people, Eastern Europeans, black people were inferior. They believed that they were literally biologically inferior, and that they were a threat to the strength of the Aryan race, and that they shouldn't be in Germany at all. They believe in traditional conservative gender roles. So they believe that men should provide for the family, be workers working in industry or in agriculture. Remember, industry is factories, agriculture is farming. And they believe that men should fight in the army. Heavy emphasis on militarism and warfare, the glorification of war and the army. Contrary-wise, they believed that women were there to be mothers, to be housewives, and to serve their husbands. So what they wanted to achieve was they wanted to fight to get the land back that was lost in the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, that was 13% of land, including territory in the west, Alsace-Lorraine, and territory in the east that was taken and given to Poland. They also believed that Austria and Germany should be united, because people from Germany and Austria were considered Aryan. And then they wanted to create something called Lebensraum. So Lebensraum is a living space for Aryans in Europe. So they wanted to take back the land from the Treaty of Versailles, but they wanted to go beyond that and take more land so that the Aryan race could grow and could thrive and could, in essence, take over Europe. Finally, the Nazis were anti-democratic. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe that people should have the right to vote and should have all of the freedoms enjoyed in a democracy. They believe that democracy made a country weak. They thought that government should be autocratic. They believed that government should be dictatorships, and that one person or one party should have total power over the country in order to get things done. So the individuals weren't really important. It was about working together as a collective, and everybody had to play their role to make the country as strong as it could possibly be. Okay, so just a really quick knowledge check. Can you answer these questions? It might be good to write them down, but you can do it mentally if you want to. Please pause the video, and we'll go through the answers in just a sec and see if we can fill in any gaps that you might have. Okay, so how did you do? The first question was, what happened during the Munich Putsch? So this was in November 1923. It was part of this year of crisis. There's a lot that happens in 1923, including the occupation of the Ruhr, hyperinflation, and the Munich Putsch. If you've forgotten that, please go back to part one and review it. But Hitler, Ludendorff, 2,000 supporters, and the SA brown shirts marched into a beer hall in Munich and took two Bavarian politicians hostage. Their names are von Kahr and von Lossow. What the Nazis are trying to do is take over the government. They want to overthrow the Weimar government and implement an autocratic dictatorship under Hitler, and then Ludendorff would take control of the German army. The putsch fails because the hostages were allowed to leave at some point after swearing an oath of loyalty to Hitler, and they do raise the alarm. So they inform the government, who informs the army, and the army crushed the putsch. So as the Nazis were marching through Munich the next morning, the army opened fire. Hitler initially escapes. His escape lasts about 3 days. He's arrested, sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, but he actually serves 9 months in prison. So how does he benefit? There's two main things that you need to understand. He does get a lot of publicity, but he uses his time in prison to write an autobiography called Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. It was used as propaganda later on to share his ideas. It doesn't actually become a bestseller until around 1930, 1931, when his propaganda machine really steps up, but it's out there in the 1920s. This is really important though. Hitler realizes, this is how it links to this revision video, is that Hitler realizes that he couldn't come to power by using violence. A political putsch wasn't really going to work. It hadn't worked in the past. Numerous political putschs had failed in the early 1920s. What he needed to do was he needed to disguise himself as a respectable politician, get the trust of the Reichstag, get the trust of the German people, and win the hearts and minds of the German people legitimately. He knew he had to be voted into power, even though he didn't agree with democracy. He needed to use democracy to get into power and then destroy democracy from the inside and consolidate his power once he was in the position of chancellor. So he really set his sights on chancellor at this point, and the first step is getting the votes, because the chancellor was traditionally the leader of the largest party in the Reichstag. So he had to get enough votes in order to become chancellor first. So let's have a look at the different factors that helped Hitler to become chancellor, helped the Nazis to rise to power by January 1933. This could form 12-mark question, so I really want you to take this seriously. This is a big part of the course. So can you write down the following 5 headings, the following 5 factors, with about 5 to 8 lines in between, depending on your handwriting. So the first heading is the Great Depression, that's 1930 to 1933. The next is the appeal of Hitler himself, his charisma, his skills as an individual. The next links to that, but Nazi party tactics, the structure of the party. So that's going to be things like how they use propaganda, how they use the SA, parades and rallies, any methods that the Nazi party are using. It could be written in a question as Nazi party tactics, methods, or it could really throw you by saying the structure of the party, but it does mean the same thing. The fear of communism. And then the failure of the Weimar government. Again, it could be phrased as like weaknesses of the Weimar government, problems with the Weimar government, but something along the lines of like the failure that the government are having. So just pause the video to give you time to do that before we go through the information. Okay, so the Great Depression, 1930 to 1933, is the first factor that helps Hitler to secure the role as Chancellor. So during the golden years, 1924 to 1929, support for extremism drops in Germany. In 1928, the Nazis get just 12 seats in the Reichstag, which is about 2% of the vote, I believe. So the Nazis really aren't very popular in 1928 because times are good. People don't turn to extremists when the government is doing their job and when the government is giving this illusion, at least, of prosperity, when people are able to go out and enjoy themselves and times are not that extreme. The Great Depression marks a turning point, though, because things start to go wrong again in Germany and support for extremism starts to rise. Remember, when times are extreme, people turn to extremists. So the Great Depression starts with the Wall Street crash in October 1929. It's when the US stock market crashes and the USA recall all international loans. So they ask Germany for the money back from the Dawes Plan and it has to be paid immediately. German banks go bust. The largest banks in Germany go completely bankrupt. They recall their loans from businesses, and businesses without funding also go bust. Unemployment reaches its peak in 1932, which is the figure of 6.1 million, but 6 million unemployed by 1932. Now, this is also when the Nazis get the most votes. So their votes skyrocket to they end up getting 230 seats in the Reichstag and becoming the largest party in the Reichstag in 1932. Now, how do they do it? They promise people work and bread. They promise the 6 million unemployed work and bread. And they also promise other things. They promise to rip up the Treaty of Versailles, get revenge for the First World War, and make Germany great again. They also provide a scapegoat. So in his speeches, Hitler blames Jewish people and communists for all of Germany's problems. If you look at speeches from the time, the two are kind of used interchangeably. So he'll say things like the communist Jews or the communists are Jews, and he uses the two words together, which is a total falsehood. That there's no correlation between Judaism and communism, but this is part of the kind of myth that he's creating. It's part of his ideology that he's creating, that Jews and communists are one and the same, and that they are responsible for all of Germany's problems, including the loss of World War One, the Treaty of Versailles, the problems that Germany had seen throughout the 20s, and now the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. So the next factor is the appeal of Hitler himself, and that links directly to the Great Depression. So Hitler was able to see the opportunity in the Great Depression. He was able to look at the Great Depression, look at the problems it was causing, and then offer a solution which made him more appealing. So these things definitely link together. The Great Depression makes Hitler more appealing because he's promising things like work and bread. So Hitler is an excellent orator. Oracy is speech making. An excellent orator means that he's very good at making speeches. He's very charismatic, very likable, very passionate, was able to win over people at the time. He's able to win the hearts and minds of the German people. But what's interesting about what Hitler does compared to what the communists were doing at the time is the communists appealed to certain groups in society, where Hitler was able to gain a broad appeal. So what that means is lots of different groups voted for Hitler. He managed to win over lots of different groups. He was like a political chameleon. He changed what he was promising depending on who he was talking to. He changed his propaganda to appeal to different groups of people. He didn't promise everybody one thing like the communists were doing. He was able to kind of switch it up and change what he was promising depending on who he wanted to win over at the time. And it helped him to win over lots of different groups. So some of the groups that Hitler managed to win over, it'd be good to give some examples if this was a question you asked. He won over big business by promising big contracts to factory owners and business owners, promised to improve the economy, which appealed to them, also promised to destroy communism, which appealed to them because, of course, if the communists got into power, they would lose their businesses. He won over farmers in a very similar way. He promised like tax reductions, higher crop prices. He promised that their land couldn't be taken if they got into debt. A lot of them were now in debt because of the Great Depression, so that was really appealing. And again, he promised to destroy communism, which the farmers were scared of communism because they don't want to lose their land. He won over German Christians, again, because he said he was going to destroy communism. Communism is generally anti-religious, so Christians were worried that the power of the church would be limited within Germany if the communists got into power. And then finally, he won over women and rural communities and conservative people in villages and in smaller towns because he was opposed to the golden years. He was opposed to Weimar culture. He spoke about how Weimar culture and the cabaret shows and the American jazz movement had degraded morals in Germany, and it meant that Germany was a place where the wrong kind of ideas are being spread, and it was threatening young people, and how they needed to return to traditional family values and save Germany from this American influence and save Germany from this sexual freedom and this sexual liberation and all the things that were happening with Weimar culture. So it'd be good to have some examples of who Hitler was appealing to and why or how. Hitler was a master in propaganda. He started off as the propaganda leader in the Nazi Party before he took over leadership of the party altogether. And he recruited Joseph Goebbels later to lead propaganda, who again was really talented at propaganda. What they were able to do through radios, newspapers, pamphlets, posters, was highlight problems in Germany, the weaknesses of the government, the economic problems caused by the Great Depression, the social issues, such as I said, like the cabaret shows and the open sexuality of women. And he was able to promise solutions. So with the economic problems, he promises work and bread. With the political problems, he promises like strong leadership. With the social problems, he said he's going to return to traditional values. He just promises different things, which again allow this broader appeal. And as I said before, it'd be good to have some precise evidence. This is a really good one. So by July 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag with 230 seats. In 1928, they'd gained just 12 seats. Of course, this is because of the Great Depression, but it's also because of Hitler's broad appeal and how he's able to get that broad appeal by promising different things to different people. This slide shows those results. I want you to focus on the first two rows to begin with. So you can see in May 1928, before the Great Depression, the Nazis on just 12 seats, the Communists on 54 seats. So the Communists were outperforming the Nazis at that time. By September 1930, which is just a year after the Wall Street crash, the Nazis on 107 seats and the Communists on 77 seats. The Communists are getting more support as well. July 1932, it's a peak for the Nazis on 230 seats. It drops slightly by November 1932 to 196, but they're still the largest party. And the Communists following suit. The Communists actually gaining votes and looking like they're catching up the Nazis, which is where this fear of communism came from. If you look at the more moderate parties, specifically the SPD, so the bottom row, the SPD had been the largest party in the past and had been involved in a lot of the coalitions, not all of them, but a lot of the early coalitions. And they've actually lost support year on year. So this shows that people were turning away from the more moderate parties and turning towards extremism. Remember, when times are extreme, people turn to extremists. So if you compare like the Nazi Party to the SPD, you can really understand how the Great Depression affected politics. It's making politics swing more towards the extreme left and the extreme right, but especially the extreme right is making major gains. Factor is Nazi Party tactics, Nazi Party methods, the structure of the Nazi Party. It could be phrased in different ways, but it just means what's going on in the party aside from like Hitler himself. So after the Munich putsch, Hitler realised that he couldn't use violence alone to seize power. He would have to win over the hearts and minds of the people. So he adapts some different methods. He starts to grow the SA brown shirts. He grows them to 400,000 by 1932. Remember, the German army is only 100,000 men. So this is a massive paramilitary force. He uses the SA in two ways. They would beat up communists, which was popular with the farmers, the business owners, German Christians who saw communism as a major threat. But they would also intimidate voters. So as voters were going in the 1932 elections specifically, so the July 1932 elections, when voters were going in to cast their vote, groups of SA men would be waiting outside and would threaten them. If you don't vote for Hitler, you're going to be beaten up. And some people would have voted out of fear alone. He appoints Joseph Goebbels as head of propaganda, and together they successfully managed to win the hearts and minds of the German people with slogans like work and bread, promising people what they needed at the time. Again, like attacking Weimar culture to win over women, attacking communism to win over business owners and farmers, attacking the Jews more generally, so providing a scapegoat in Jewish people, which, it helped people to have someone to blame for all of Germany's problems, which again, unfortunately, got a lot of support at the time. And then there's the parades and rallies. So there'd be marches through the streets where Hitler would like make speeches, but it'd be the SA marching with the Hitler Youth. He implemented the Hitler Youth around this time. And they would all be in uniform. They would look incredibly strong and organised. And what I want you to remember is how weak the government was at this time, how chaotic the government was. And people looked at the Nazis and felt that they were a group that they could trust. Again, this links to the appeal of Hitler. It links to some of these other factors that we're discussing. The next factor is the fear of communism. So the Communist Party, otherwise known as the KPD, were getting more support in the Reichstag. We can see that on the table that I've just shown you, that I'll show you again in a second. They secured 100 seats in the Reichstag in 1932. As previously mentioned, this threatened certain groups, so farmers, big business, the elites, German Christians. They were all concerned that they would lose their property or lose their freedoms if the communists got into power. This time, Hitler seemed to be the only person who was dealing with the growing problem of communism. He was using the SA brown shirts to beat up the communists, which was popular with those groups. So farmers, business owners, middle classes, upper classes, because they would lose everything. They'd lose their land, they'd lose their businesses, their wealth, their freedoms, and things like that. Religious people, again, vote for Hitler because communism is anti-religious and Hitler was destroying communism. You can link this back to like the structure of the Nazi Party, Nazi tactics. Obviously, he's using the SA to beat them up, but don't forget he's attacking communism in the propaganda as well. Communism at this time was like closely linked to Russia. You see a lot of those links highlighted by Hitler as well in his propaganda, how the communists would make Germany into a Soviet state like Russia, and nobody would be able to own any private property. And again, it won over these groups that had property to lose. Just that table again, if you'd forgotten it, the communists are the second row down. If you look at the last column, it tells us that in November 1932, the communists got 100 seats. They're gaining year on year, whereas the Nazis do have a slight drop in 1932. So the growth of communism was really scary for a lot of these groups that had things to lose. So the last factor you need to know about is the failure of the Weimar government. On a paper, it could also say the weaknesses of the government or the problems in the Weimar government, problems in the Weimar Republic, something like that. It all means the same thing. So the Weimar government at this point had been in power for 13 years, and they'd failed to deal with many of the economic and political problems that had happened in Germany. Now, you could make a list of the issues that they'd overseen and the things that people were angry about. The loss of World War One, the armistice, they were called November criminals. They'd stabbed Germany in the back with the Treaty of Versailles. The reparations were enormous and Germany couldn't afford them, which led to the occupation of the Ruhr and hyperinflation in 1923. In the early period, we had a lot of political unrest, a lot of political problems, and although they do sign the Dawes Plan and get some economic recovery in the 1920s, it had all crashed and burnt again in 1929, which was an issue that they'd caused by signing the Dawes Plan and making the German economy reliant on America. So lots of problems. We've had lots of coalitions, countless chancellors, 17, I think, different chancellorships. Some chancellors are in power more than once, but over 13 years, 17 different chancellorships. Loads of elections, like elections were happening really regularly, and nobody is dealing with any of the problems. You've also got some groups, specifically the middle class, that had lost out more than once. So they'd lost out in hyperinflation, they'd lost all their savings in the bank then in 1923, and then in 1929, 1930, they'd lost all of their savings in the bank again, just as they rebuilt themselves. There's also some constitutional issues, so some issues with the Weimar Constitution. So the first is proportional representation. So proportional representation is when the percentage of votes a party gets is equal to the number of seats they get in the Reichstag. This meant that there were lots of small parties in the Reichstag, and all they did was argue. No one party had the majority, so laws were being passed really slowly, if at all, and we get all these coalitions, so different parties ruling together, the biggest of which was the Grand Coalition, which I believe included 6 parties. They weren't working together. They were failing to solve any of the issues and failing to get laws passed because all the parties in the coalitions had different views, so they just spent all their time arguing. The only way that things were getting done was Article 48, which is when the president, at this time President Hindenburg, could pass laws alone in an emergency. It was an emergency decree. However, it wasn't just being used in emergencies anymore. It was being abused, it was being overused, specifically in like the early 1930s. You see it being used all the time. And an example of something that it was used for was to take rich people's land and give it to poor peasants so that it can be used to farm crops for the people. People felt, specifically landowners and the middle classes, the landowners that were affected by this, they felt that this was an abuse of this emergency decree. So what does this tell us? So proportional representation and Article 48 tell us that democracy wasn't working. People didn't see democracy as working. They saw it as slow. They saw it as corrupt. They were losing faith. They were disillusioned, and they wanted a dictatorship. They wanted a strong leader, autocratic leadership, somebody who would come in and get things done. And Hitler again saw this and provided himself as the solution. So in 1930 to 1932, multiple chancellors resign. It's because they can't deal with the problems caused by the Great Depression. They don't have economic solutions, and they keep losing the support of the Reichstag. The first chancellor that resigns is Brüning, then von Papen, and then von Schleicher. So you get three chancellors in quite quick succession that resign. Side note, but from July 1932, technically Hitler should have been Chancellor of Germany because he was the leader of the largest party. However, von Papen and von Schleicher were picked by Hindenburg first. Hindenburg's the president, he gets to pick the Chancellor because Hindenburg didn't trust Hitler and saw Hitler as too extreme. So this is a really important date, 30th of January 1933, President Hindenburg reluctantly makes Hitler Chancellor of Germany. So remember, Chancellor is like Prime Minister. Now it's important to note that Hitler is Chancellor of a democratic country. So Germany is not a dictatorship yet. Hitler's still got a way to go to secure his power, but he's in a position of power. The only person with more power than him now is Hindenburg. Hindenburg poses a bit of a problem for Hitler because Hindenburg doesn't trust Hitler and can dismiss him at any time. So Hindenburg does try and limit Hitler's power in two ways. He makes von Papen from the Centre Party Hitler's vice-chancellor to try and drag Hitler more towards the centre and away from the extreme right, to try and neutralise some of Hitler's more extreme views. It doesn't work. And he also only allows Hitler to have two Nazis in the cabinet. So the cabinet are the most important politicians, and Hitler is only able to pick two Nazis. That's in contrast to von Papen, who was able to pick his entire cabinet and picked rich aristocratic landowners who weren't politicians and didn't have seats in the Reichstag, which was part of his downfall. But Hitler, the same rules didn't apply to Hitler. Hitler was dealt with in a much stricter way by Hindenburg, and Hindenburg says, no, you're only allowed two Nazis in the cabinet, and everybody else had to be from other parties. Again, it's to try and make Hitler less extreme. Okay, so let's link this to an exam question. This is an exam question that you very much could be asked on the paper. This is kind of how this content typically comes up, is on this 12 marker. So you could be asked, which of the following was the most important reason that the Nazi Party rose to power by 1933? And then you're given two of the factors that we've just discussed. So the question here says the failure of the Weimar government or the appeal of Adolf Hitler. It's worth 12 marks. You do have to discuss both bullet points. If you only discuss one bullet point, you're going to get about 5 out of 12, absolute maximum. That's if you do one bullet point really well. You have to discuss both bullet points to get any higher than that, and you want to get higher than that. So you'd write a paragraph about the failure of the government, giving maybe 2 examples, explaining it really well. So explaining how those failures helped the Nazis to rise to power. Remember the tail of the question, the root of the question. And then you'd write a paragraph about the appeal of Hitler, again giving a couple of examples and really explaining how the appeal of Adolf Hitler himself helped the Nazis to get into power. Make your evidence as precise as you can. So using things like the Nazis were able to get 230 seats in the Reichstag by 1932 by promising work and bread, for example. Another way this question could be phrased, it's essentially the same question. Which of the following was the most important reason why Hitler became chancellor in 1933? So anything to do with 1933 is the same question, really. And then I've put two different factors here. So the fear of communism and Nazi party tactics. So again, you'll write a good paragraph about the fear of communism, giving some examples, really explaining how the fear of communism helped Hitler to become chancellor. That's really important. Please don't skip that step. And then Nazi party tactics. So you're talking about propaganda, the essay, and how that's helping Hitler to become chancellor. So it's helping him to win the hearts and minds of the people and get votes. Now, the best questions will have a conclusion. Sorry, the best answers will have a conclusion. So you'll say which you think's the most important. Top marks, so anything above 9 out of 12, will go to people that can link them together. So for that first question, you can talk about how the failure of the government made Hitler more appealing. So the failure of the government to deal with the economic problems like the Great Depression meant that middle classes found Hitler quite appealing because he was offering solutions. The second one, the fear of communism and Nazi party tactics, you could talk about communism was feared by certain groups. The Nazis, using the SA and using propaganda to attack the communists, won the votes of those groups that were fearful of communism, such as farmers, big business, German Christians, for example. Okay, so what problems does Hitler still have when he becomes Chancellor in January 1933? So as previously mentioned, President Hindenburg still doesn't trust Hitler at all. He thinks Hitler is too extreme, and he could dismiss Hitler at any time and replace him with yet another Chancellor. He's dismissed Brüning, von Papen, von Schleicher. He can do it again. He can dismiss Hitler and just put somebody else into the position. Hindenburg is showing that he doesn't trust Hitler by limiting Hitler's power. He makes von Papen his vice-chancellor, and he also only allows 2 Nazis in the cabinet. So this is stopping Hitler from having the control that he wants. The other thing that's limiting Hitler's power is that Germany, for now, is still a democracy. Hitler's limited by the constitution or the rules. So there are other political parties. The other parties can challenge him. The Reichstag could challenge him. And despite being the largest party in the Reichstag, he's just short of a majority. He's got like 40-something%. I think or is it 37%? I can't remember, but he's got less than 50% of the Reichstag anyway. So he doesn't have the majority needed to effectively pass laws. So he needs to have a majority before he could pass laws. The Nazis are going to find it very difficult to make any changes they want to make while operating in this democracy where they do not have the majority. You also need 2/3 of the Reichstag to change the constitution or to change any of the rules. So to make Germany this autocratic dictatorship that he wanted to make it, he'd have to have 2/3 of the Reichstag, and he's got less than half the Reichstag at this time. Okay, so again, another exam question. This is quite a hard one. 5 minutes, describe 2 problems that Hitler faced when he became Chancellor. So first paragraph, I'd talk about Hindenburg and how Hindenburg is limiting Hitler's power. Second paragraph, I'd talk about how Germany is a democracy and Hitler doesn't have the majority. He's limited by the constitution. As I said, if you're revising nice and early, I really recommend doing these exam questions and giving them to your class teacher for feedback. If you're doing it the night before, you're cramming right now, keep going, keep powering on. You're doing really, really well. So the last thing we need to look at for part 2 is how Hitler consolidates his power by 1934. So consolidating your power means locking down your power, securing your power, getting rid of any opposition, anybody that can challenge you. So the question is basically asking how Hitler destroys democracy, gets rid of those problems that we've just discussed, and makes Germany a dictatorship, gets total power for himself and for the Nazi Party. So for this one, you have 4 different factors. Again, just write down the 4 factors with about 5 to 8 lines between, depending on handwriting, or you can split a page into 4 boxes using a ruler and just put a heading in each box. But the factors we're going to look at that helped Hitler to consolidate his power by 1934, the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, the Night of the Long Knives, and the death of President Hindenburg. So pause the video, just give yourself a bit of time to do that. Okay, so the first is the Reichstag fire. So although Hitler was chancellor, he doesn't have the majority he needed to effectively pass laws. He needs more votes. He needs to be over 50% of the Reichstag in order to pass the laws that he needs to pass. So he calls an election for March 5th. So he becomes chancellor on the 30th of January, and he doesn't waste any time. He calls an election for March 5th, 1933. He's hoping that he would get enough votes to secure a majority and be able to pass laws easily. On the 27th of February, so a week before the election was due to take place, the Reichstag building burns down. So the dome is completely damaged. It causes over £1 million worth of damage. And Hitler takes the opportunity. He blames a young Dutch communist called van der Lubbe, who was in the area at the time. And he says that the fire was part of a larger plot by the communists to overthrow the German government and launch a full-scale communist revolution. The following day, he's able to convince President Hindenburg to give him emergency powers to deal with the problem of communism, to deal with the perceived communist threat. It was a law that was called the Law for the Protection of People and State, but if you just remember it as like a special protection law, that would be okay as well. And that allowed Hitler to do several things. He banned the communists from running in the election on March 5th. He bans the communist newspaper from printing anything. He totally shuts down their newspaper, and he bans the communists from meeting. He also suspends the rights to a fair police investigation, so the police aren't able to properly investigate the Reichstag fire, and they just have to accept Hitler's version of events, that it was started by van der Lubbe and the communists. Van der Lubbe is executed. But what's happened here, although he is just attacking the Communist Party specifically, he's suspended the right for political parties to run in the election, specifically the communists, but that's a big thing. He's also suspended the freedom of the press. Again, he's attacked a communist newspaper, but he has started to get rid of freedom of the press. He's also got rid of the freedom of assembly, which is the freedom to meet. Again, he has targeted at the communists for now, but the communists are just the first group that are going to be targeted, and he'll take it a step further later on. And then also he's taken control of police investigation, again, just for this one event, but it's a foreshadowing of what's to come. So how does this affect the election? So groups that feared communism were obviously happy. The farmers, big business, religious leaders, and the Nazis end up getting more votes than ever before. But they're still slightly short of the majority that they needed to make changes. The Centre Party, though, merged with the Nazi Party to give them the majority that they needed. So now the Nazis dominate the Reichstag, and they can make actual changes, not only just passing laws, but changes to the constitution. They can literally change the rules of the country now because they've got so much power. So what does Hitler do with this newfound power? He passes the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act was a law that enabled Hitler, or allowed Hitler, to make laws alone for 4 years. So that's a typo there. It's meant to say make laws alone for 4 years. He didn't have to ask the Reichstag for support. He didn't need the approval of the Reichstag. He could just pass any laws he wanted for the next 4 years. It gave Hitler a lot more power than any chancellor before him, and he used this law to ban all other political parties. He banned trade unions, so that the workers couldn't go on strike, and he had control of the workforce. He also introduced the Gestapo, which were his own secret police force. He took control of the German police too. He took over all local and state governments, and he took over the media. He set up the Reich Press Chamber, which was his own Nazi press, and he started to indoctrinate or brainwash the public with his ideology. This is a massive step. This is Germany effectively, or it is Germany becoming a dictatorship at this time. So now we're jumping forward a year to 1934 and the Night of the Long Knives. So by 1934, the SA Brown Shirts, so Hitler's private army, his stormtroopers, his bodyguards, were 2 million strong. think the German army is still, well, at this time he started to grow it, but the German army had been 100,000 men. So think about that level of power in comparison. The SA at this point had intimidated voters, beaten up communists, and they saw themselves as the reason that Hitler got into power, and they wanted payment from Hitler. Hitler had promised them good jobs when he got into power, and that wasn't really coming into fruition. So the SA wanted Hitler to carry through with his promise. They said to Hitler, if you like, we got you into power, we want rewards for doing so. A lot of the SA were just unemployed, violent thugs. They weren't trained military personnel. They weren't trained, disciplined soldiers. They were just like an army of thugs. And now they were giving Hitler an ultimatum that we want payment for helping you to get into power. The big problem that Hitler had is that the SA were more loyal to their leader, Ernst Röhm, than to him. And to make matters worse, there were rumours circulating that Ernst Röhm was planning to join the SA with the German army to make a people's army and to challenge Hitler to power. So Hitler was very concerned that Röhm might try and seize power from him. The SA made Ernst Röhm incredibly powerful. So on the 30th of June 1934, the Night of the Long Knives happens. So Hitler takes the actions of executing Ernst Röhm and 400 other political opponents, including other SA leaders and including people from his past. So von Kahr, who was one of the politicians that had sabotaged the Munich Putsch in 1923, and von Schleicher, who was an ex-chancellor who was put into power instead of Hitler in 1932. He then replaced Ernst Röhm with Heinrich Himmler, and he replaced the SA with the SS Blackshirts. The SS Blackshirts were a smaller group, so around 240,000 men, but they are elite soldiers. They are disciplined, they swore an oath of loyalty to Hitler, and they were more effective. Now Hitler used propaganda, so he made a speech after the event and published propaganda after the event that told the German people that he had protected them from a violent takeover and that he had made the ultimate sacrifice by executing some of his friends in order to keep Germany safe, which won him more support. But we can really see how Hitler was able to twist events in the press. Remember, he owns the press at this point, he controls the press, and he's able to really censor the truth, so cut out the truth so that people never really find out what really happened during this event. He also reports the death toll as much lower. So I can't remember what the official figures are, but it's much, much, much lower than 400 political opponents that are killed. And then finally, a month after the Night of the Long Knives, President Hindenburg dies. So in August 1934, President Hindenburg dies. He's very old at this point, well into his 80s, and Hitler uses the Enabling Act to merge the roles of President and Chancellor to create a new role for himself, the Führer. So Führer is just the German word for leader, but it means that Hitler has total power now. He is a dictator. He is judge and executioner. He decides who lives and who dies. He decides the laws in Germany. And the final step is making the army, the German army, swear an oath of loyalty to him. So Germany is no longer democracy. It is a dictatorship. Hitler has total control. He has consolidated his power by August 1934. Okay, so how could this come up as a question? Again, they like to do it as a question 6. It could come up as other questions as well, but let's practice question 6 because it is worth the most marks. So you could be asked, which of the following was the most important reason that Hitler was able to consolidate his power by 1934? The Reichstag fire or the Enabling Act? Again, if you only write about one of the bullet points, you're limiting yourself to about 4 or 5 marks. If you do it very well, I would definitely recommend talking about both bullet points. The best answers would give a judgment about which is the most important. You should be aiming to do that. The very best answers, so anything above 9 out of 12, will link the two together. This is a dream of a question. It's really easy to link them together. You'd argue that the Reichstag fire was the most important because without the Reichstag fire, he wouldn't have stirred up the fear of communism to get the majority to be able to pass the Enabling Act in the first place. So no Reichstag fire, no Enabling Act. So that's an easy one. The other question question that I've got here is, which of the following was the most important reason that Germany became a dictatorship? The Night of the Long Knives or the death of Hindenburg? What I need you to do with this question is I need you to be addressing the bit that's highlighted. So I need you to be talking about how the Reichstag fire helped Hitler to consolidate his power, how the Enabling Act gave Hitler more power, how the Night of the Long Knives helped him get rid of opposition and make himself a dictator, how the death of Hindenburg helped him to create a dictatorship. Please make sure you're doing that. If you're not doing that, you could land yourself with 2 pages of writing done and 3 marks out of 12 because you haven't properly addressed the question. So please do not tell me a story about the Reichstag fire. Don't tell me a story about the Night of the Long Knives. State what happened, but put the emphasis on how it helped Hitler to get more power, how it helped Hitler to consolidate his power. Okay, so that's everything for part 2. As I said, part 2 is easier than part 1. Part 2 is shorter than part 1. The only thing you've got to revise now is part 3. So any question that you get after 1934 will be about Hitler, how Hitler controlled Germany, how he controls Germany, how he indoctrinates people, and how he rules over the country until 1945. So please make sure that you go and revise part 3. Keep going, you're doing really, really well.